for this lecture, we're going to be sort of building on the previous lecture on migration from Haiti to the U.S., particularly thinking about migration not only as a movement of people, but also the mobilization and negotiation of nationalism through the creation of transnational identities, right? In the case of Haiti, we saw transnational identity that was based on ideas about blood and race that link them directly to Haiti. But here we're going to talk more about migration within Europe, right? And migration in Europe, it's a little bit different, right? Because, well, geographically it's different, right? So before we start talking about that, I wanted to just reflect a little bit. How would you define migration? How would you define a migrant? And why do people migrate, right? And here especially I'm thinking about, for example, what is the distinction between a tourist and a migrant? What is the distinction between, for example, if you have moved within the U.S., do you consider yourself a migrant? What if you're traveling from New York to LA? Is that a form of migration? What if you're traveling from Phoenix to Las Vegas? Is that a form of migration? Does distance matter? What is the difference between a tourist and a migrant? What does it mean to, for example, if you are an exchange student and you study abroad for a semester, right? Does that make you a migrant? And then later on, why do people migrate, right? Is it because they want to, because they have to, perhaps a combination of both, right? And at the same time, neither of those options. So really think about the way in which this is framed, and the way in which people think about this, and also the ways in which you have been affected by migration. In one way or another, everyone has been affected by migration. Not everyone in the U.S. is a migrant, right? The idea that the U.S. we're all migrants, that's not true, right? There are people who were here before Europeans came to this continent, so not everyone is a migrant, but everyone has been affected by migration in one way or another, and in different ways. So first of all, the distance of the way in which countries are connected through migration has a long history of colonization, right? I mean, it's linked to a longer history of colonization. And in a lot of ways, you'll see that the specific countries continue to migrate to those countries that used to control them politically, right? So for example, people from the Caribbean is not necessarily shown here, but people from Jamaica will tend to migrate to the UK, right? Because there's still a connection there. And the same thing with people in Africa, right? So distance is important. At the same time, it's not the defining feature of migration. And when we think about this particular article by Didier Fasson, I want to think about the ideas that he's trying to mobilize, the ideas that he wants you to reflect on. These ideas about compassion and repression. When are we allowed, when are we encouraged to feel compassion for someone that we consider a migrant? When are we sort of compelled to act in a repressive way when we're thinking about migrants, right? And this is influenced by the way in which migrants are portrayed, but it also influences how these portraits sort of circulate in the media, in social media, but also in traditional media, right? So here we have two images of people migrating within the sort of European context. Here we have a picture of the way in which people from Central America and Mexico are represented when they are migrating to the US, right? So already there are a lot of implications here that are not really attending the real conditions that are producing this migration, right? And that tend to reduce migrants to individuals and not to people who are connected to larger contexts. So, according to what you see in the media, which migrants, right, should receive our compassion, and which migrants should be watched and controlled, and why is there a difference between different migrants, the way in which we construct the images of different migrants. So in the current context of migration, according to Didier Fasson, especially in Europe, attitudes towards migrants and refugees have changed. This idea this concept that he uses, the moral economy of European countries, now can be described as compassionate repression. And Didier Fasson is specifically talking about migrants who are camping. They believe that at the time of this article they were camping near this port in France called Calais, and they wanted to sort of ride the train that goes underground to Dover in the UK, in England, right? Because at the time England had more a policy that was more open towards migrants than France, and also because there were different sort of connections between migrants and the UK. So he's working. This is the tunnel, right? And if you ever go to France and want to take the train to England, you'll go through this tunnel, and it's not really a long trip. Obviously, there's not. You don't see anything. You just go underground. But basically, migrants, people in France who are not from France, right, who are coming from other parts of Africa, of Asia, of Europe, are trying to cross through that tunnel through England to then ask for the legal status of refugee. This is the camp where Didier Fasson was doing research, right, called Sangat, also called the jungle in some accounts, right? So this camp that you saw in the last slide, this was originally started just as a transitory point where migrants would wait until they could cross to England. But then England started strengthening its migratory policies for political reasons, right? Migration is always a political weapon. And these transitory migrants became permanent in France. This created, of course, not only people who were living there in these very precarious conditions, but also the rise of smugglers who were smuggling people in 2001 with all of the risk that involves. And Didier Fasson wants to use this concept from an Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben, where he wants to say that in a lot of ways we think of this camp, the jungle, as a state of exception. That is a place where social norms are suspended for these subjects that were considered undesirable and that in theory represent a threat to the public order. The camp, in this sense, sort of stands in contrast with the polis, right? The city, the place where people can live a full life that has a political existence, where they can become the citizen. And in the polis, they have this full life that we contrast with the bare life of the vagabond that inhabits the camp. As conditions worsened in Sangat, migrants became refugees, right? So they were transitory migrants, then the UK sort of closed its border, and then they became refugees, but only in name, right? Because their legal status remained the same. And this is where it's important to think about migration historically and what it has meant, right? Because Didier Fasson wants to say that asylum seekers had been very important especially during the Second World War, when they were fleeing Nazi regimes, right? They became important, and oftentimes they would be seen as freedom fighters, people who had the right to live full lives. So they were welcomed in a lot of different places, right? In the US, all through Latin America, all through different parts of Europe, right? But now we've changed that attitude, and now we think of refugees and asylum seekers not as those freedom fighters and political activists that were living full lives and who were valued because of their ideas, but rather were only valuing or we only care about refugees because we see them as suffering and ill migrants who don't live full lives but rather just live bare lives. This is the distinction, right? Bare life Zoe versus full life bios. So in this article, Fassan wants to argue that in a lot of ways our attitudes towards migration have changed, and now we emphasize the suffering body over the political conditions of asylum seekers or able-bodied migrants. And this is one of the changes that he sees as fundamental in how we think about migrants now. So in France, humanitarian approaches in granting residence now give preference to individuals who are sick, not necessarily those who are able-bodied and want to work like before, but rather it's those who are sick and almost dying, right? So in a lot of cases, Fastan talks about people almost wanting to be sick so that they can get a refugee status. And this is what it means. This is what we mean when we talk about biopolitics. This is the politics that deal with the lives of human beings. The politics of pity and the politics of control. Who lives and who dies. The idea of the sick migrants are more desirable as migrants than able-bodied migrants points to ideas about racial security and a form of compassionate repression. And it also sort of highlights, right, how our emotions toward refugees and migrants are also shaped by these larger discourses, and how in a lot of cases when we're watching these images on the media, on the TV, on Twitter, on Instagram, and we see refugees, in a lot of cases, Fassan wants to say, expressing this sympathy, it's really more about us, about showing how humane we are, and not necessarily about what will happen to these people. Thank you.